All right, so let's jump right in to this pretty intense situation. We're down in Southern California where it seems like everything's on fire. And I'm not just talking about the actual wildfires. We've got a whole stack of news articles, social media posts, expert analysis, and it's all adding up to a pretty volatile situation.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. What's really striking is how this disaster is playing out against the backdrop of, well, a presidential transition. A brand new administration is about to come in. And this crisis, this is their first big test.
And some would say they're already fumbling it. I mean, you've got Governor Newsom, who might be thinking about a 2028 presidential run. He's caught right in the middle of this inferno,
Hmm.
literally and politically. And then you've got L.A. Mayor Karen Bass, who's facing a lot of heat because she was out of the country when these fires first broke out.
Yeah, that's right. But I think if we just focus on what each of them did, we might be missing the bigger picture here. This situation, it's a perfect example of how natural disasters can really expose the cracks in our political system. Everyone's pointing fingers, trying to lay blame. And it's not just about who's in charge at this moment. It goes deeper than that. It's about these deep ideological divides that we have in this country.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. President-elect Trump, he's already throwing punches from miles away, calling California Democrats incompetent. And he's putting the blame for these fires squarely on their policies.
I think it's really important that we take a close look at those claims. You know how we manage our forests, how we allocate our water resources, these are important things. But to say that those policies are the sole cause of these fires, I think that's an oversimplification of a really complex problem. We have to consider climate change, years of drought development patterns. All of these contribute to the risk of wildfires.
It's definitely not a simple equation. But that hasn't stopped Trump and his allies like Richard Grenell. They're pushing this narrative about far-left policies being to blame. And even Elon Musk has jumped on that bandwagon. It feels like they're trying to use this tragedy to score political points.
And this is where I think the comparison to the COVID-19 pandemic comes in. We saw how disaster response and aid distribution became so politicized. It makes you wonder, are we going to see the same thing happen here? Will federal aid become a bargaining chip in this political game?
Especially when you consider Trump's history of being skeptical about giving FEMA aid to California. Some people are worried he's going to use this as an excuse to withhold assistance.
It's a valid concern. Incoming Vice President J.D. Vance, he's been trying to reassure everyone, saying that Trump cares about all Americans. But you look at his track record, and it's hard to feel totally confident. We need to go beyond just words and look at what actually happens. How will the administration allocate these resources? Will they put the needs of the people who are suffering first? Or will this aid get caught up in political maneuvering?
This is a really high-stakes situation, especially for Newsom. He's trying to get help from the very person who's attacking him and his state publicly. He even invited Trump to come to California to see the devastation for himself.
I find that invitation very interesting. On the surface, it seems like a good faith gesture, like he's trying to de-escalate the situation. But it could also be a strategic move, forcing Trump to face the reality of what's happened, making it harder for him to justify withholding aid.
It's a tricky situation for Newsom. He has to balance his own political goals with the needs of the people he represents, all while dealing with this unpredictable new administration. He even admitted that he had to bite his tongue and hold back some choice words for Trump.
And it's not just tension between Democrats and Republicans. There are some cracks showing within the Democratic Party itself. Newsom has hinted that he's frustrated with local officials, like he's not getting straight answers about what's going on. And then you have Congressman Adam Schiff. He's calling for an independent investigation to look into how water management issues may have hampered the firefighting efforts in the Pacific Palisades. He's even suggesting a broader commission to examine the entire disaster response.
So it's not just California facing a potential standoff with the federal government. There's also some infighting happening within the state's own leadership. It's like a pressure cooker in here.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it highlights how important leadership is during a crisis like this. Who's going to step up and be a unifying force? Who's going to prioritize the needs of the people over scoring political points?
Well, one name that keeps coming up is L.A. County Supervisor Catherine Barger. She's a Republican, and she's getting a lot of attention for how she's responded, especially for this letter that she sent to Trump.
It's interesting to see how Barger is positioning herself in all of this. She's taking a different approach than a lot of her fellow Republicans. Instead of piling on with the attacks, she's actually praising Trump for what he did during the 2018 Woolsey fire. But at the same time, she's subtly nudging him to provide support for the current crisis.
Her letter, almost feels like a calculated move, like she's playing chess. By reminding Trump of what he did before, she's appealing to his sense of accomplishment and maybe paving the way for a more cooperative relationship.
Yeah, it's a pretty savvy tactic. But the question is, will it work? Will Trump respond to this softer approach? Or is he going to double down on his criticism?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're seeing two very different leadership styles emerge from this crisis.
Yeah.
You have the confrontational approach from Trump and his allies, lots of accusations and political maneuvering. And then you have Barger's more diplomatic approach, focused on working together and finding common ground.
Right. And then you have Newsom stuck in the middle, trying to navigate this political minefield while also dealing with the very real and urgent needs of the people he represents.
It's this tangled web of personalities and motivations, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how it all plays out. But before we get too lost in the political drama, we need to remember the human cost of these fires.
Absolutely. Behind all the headlines and the political posturing, there are thousands of people who have lost everything, their homes, their livelihoods, and in some cases, their loved ones.
Their stories, those are at the heart of this crisis, and we need to make sure that their voices are heard. So in our next segment, we're going to shift our focus and look at the human impact of these fires and the challenges that people are facing as they try to rebuild their lives in the face of such incredible devastation.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the political back and forth, but we can't forget about the people who are actually caught in the middle of all this. These fires, I mean, they've just ripped through communities, leaving behind so much devastation. And it's not just the physical damage, you know.
Right, we've been looking at reports from aid organizations talking to survivors, and it's clear that the emotional toll of this disaster is just immense. People have lost their homes, their lives have been turned upside down, they don't know what the future holds.
And we have to remember that these impacts aren't felt equally across the board. You know, you have these vulnerable populations, low-income communities, seniors, people with disabilities. They often face much bigger challenges in the wake of a disaster like this. They might not have the resources, the support systems, and it can be really difficult for them to navigate the recovery process.
That's such an important point. We can't just assume that everyone's starting from the same place when it comes to rebuilding. There are these systemic inequalities that make the impact of these events even worse.
Exactly. And that's where the role of the government becomes even more crucial. It's not just about providing immediate relief. It's about addressing those underlying inequalities and making sure that the recovery efforts are equitable and inclusive.
Speaking of the government response, let's go back to that tension that's brewing within the Democratic Party. Newsom seems particularly frustrated with those water management issues that made it harder to fight the fires.
Yeah, the situation in the Pacific Palisades, it's become a real flashpoint. There are these allegations that there wasn't enough water pressure in that area, which made it really tough for firefighters to contain the blaze. And Schiff calling for an independent investigation. It suggests that this might not have just been bad luck, that there might have been failures in planning and preparedness.
So this isn't just about pointing fingers at the other party. It's about acknowledging that there could be some serious problems with California's own disaster response systems.
Absolutely. And this could have some pretty big political consequences. It opens the door for a much broader conversation about accountability and responsibility. It makes you wonder, will this lead to real change? Will we see actual reforms? Or will it just get bogged down in political gamesmanship?
Meanwhile, in the middle of all this political turmoil, Newsom is trying to get the rebuilding process started. He issued an executive order that suspends some environmental regulations to try to speed up construction and recovery efforts.
Yeah, that was a controversial move. It really highlights the tension between the urgency of the situation and the need to think about long-term sustainability. On one hand, people need homes and they need them now, but on the other hand, bypassing these environmental regulations, it could have some unintended consequences and actually make things worse in the long run.
So can you break down this executive order a bit? Which regulations are being suspended, and what are the potential risks?
Sure. So it's important to understand this isn't a blanket suspension of all environmental laws. It's targeting specific regulations related to things like construction permitting, debris removal, habitat restoration. For example, it streamlines the approval process for rebuilding homes in those fire-affected areas, and it relaxes some of the rules about how they can dispose of fire debris.
Okay, so it sounds like they're trying to strike a balance between the need to take immediate action and the need to protect the environment in the long term. But are these measures enough? And what about the potential downsides?
Well, that's where things get a bit heated. Environmental groups are raising concerns about the potential impacts on water quality, air quality, sensitive habitats. They're worried that these expedited processes could lead to rushed decisions and not enough oversight.
And how is Newsom responding to this pushback?
He's emphasizing that these suspensions are temporary, and he's arguing that they're absolutely necessary to deal with this housing crisis. He's also promising to make environmental protection a priority during the rebuilding process, but it's still unclear exactly how he plans to do that.
It sounds like there are a lot of questions still up in the air, and some potential pitfalls we need to watch out for. This whole situation, it's like a microcosm of the larger challenges we face. When it comes to dealing with climate change and preparing for disasters, we have to find ways to balance these competing priorities, make tough decisions, and make sure that what we do today doesn't create even bigger problems down the road.
Exactly. And this isn't the end of the story. This is an ongoing process. The decisions that are made in the next few weeks and months, they're going to have long-term consequences, not just for California, but for how we as a society respond to this growing threat of climate-related disasters.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, just the sheer scale of the challenges we're facing. But there's also this sense of resilience and determination that's coming out of the ashes. People are coming together to help each other, to rebuild their communities, to find ways to adapt to this new reality.
Absolutely. And that's something we can't forget. There's a human story here,
Yeah.
a story of courage, compassion, and the power of community.
And those are the stories that deserve to be told. They offer a glimmer of hope in the midst of all this devastation. They remind us that even when things are really tough, the human spirit can still prevail.
Exactly. So we've talked about the political complexities, the daunting challenges, but let's not forget those individual acts of kindness, the community initiatives, the inspiring examples of resilience that are emerging from this crisis. Those are the stories that will ultimately shape the future of California.
And they offer some valuable lessons for all of us. No matter where we live or what challenges we're facing, they remind us that we're not alone, that we can overcome adversity, and that our collective actions can make a difference.
That's a great point. And this brings us to a critical point in our deep dive. We've explored the immediate impact, the political battles, the human cost of these fires. Now it's time to look beyond this immediate crisis and think about the long-term implications.
What can we learn from this disaster? How will this event change the relationship between California and the federal government? And maybe most importantly, how can we prepare for a future where these kinds of events are likely to become even more frequent and severe?
Those are the big questions that we need to grapple with. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, we're going to tackle these complex and challenging issues head-on and explore the possible paths forward and the choices that we face as a society.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the immediate impact of these fires, the political battles, the human stories, but now I think we need to take a step back and think about the bigger picture. What does this all mean for California's future?
Yeah, that's really where things start to get interesting. I think this crisis could be a turning point, a catalyst for change, both in terms of how California prepares for disasters and how the state interacts with the federal government going forward.
Especially with climate change. It's always looming in the background. This isn't just about putting out these fires and rebuilding. It's about getting ready for a future where these kinds of events might become the new normal.
Exactly. We can't keep treating these fires like they're isolated incidents, these fires. They were fueled by years of drought and made worse by rising temperatures. They're a wake-up call, a reminder that climate change, environmental policy, and disaster preparedness, they're all connected.
So where do we go from here? Is California doing enough to adapt to this new reality?
Well, there are some promising things happening. The state's been investing in wildfire prevention, things like controlled burns and forest thinning projects. They've also been working on improving early warning systems and evacuation protocols, but the scale of the problem is huge. There's still a lot of work to be done.
And what about the federal government? What role should they play in helping California?
That's the big question, and this is where those political dynamics we were talking about earlier really come into play. California needs help from the feds, both financial support and expertise, but getting that support might not be easy given the current political climate.
Especially when you have President-elect Trump and some of his allies basically saying that California brought this on themselves, that their liberal policies are to blame.
Right. And that narrative, like we said, it's misleading and it oversimplifies a complex issue. But it does make you wonder if the new administration is going to be a reliable partner in dealing with these challenges. Will they put the needs of Californians first, or will they try to use this crisis to their political advantage?
It seems like Supervisor Barger's approach, trying to find common ground with the Trump administration might be really important in getting that federal support.
It's definitely a strategy worth watching her, trying to remind Trump of how he helped during the Woolsey fire. It could work. It might soften his stance and open the door for more cooperation, but it's a risky move if she's seen as being too friendly with Trump. She could lose support from her own constituents.
And on the other side, you have Newsom and Schiff pushing for investigations, demanding accountability. They're taking a more confrontational approach, which could either force the administration to act or it could make things even more tense.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess, and nobody knows how it's going to end up. But one thing's for sure, the relationship between California and the federal government is going to be critical in how the state recovers and prepares for the future.
So for someone who's listening to all of this, trying to make sense of it all, what's the key takeaway? What should they be paying attention to as this story continues to unfold?
I'd say there are a few key things to watch for. First, how does the new administration actually allocate resources and support to California? Are they prioritizing the people who need help, or are they using aid as a political weapon?
And second, keep an eye on what's happening within California. Will Newsom's push for investigations lead to real changes? Will Barger's efforts to build bridges with the Trump administration actually work?
And finally, I think we need to look beyond the immediate crisis and think about the long game. How is California adapting to climate change? Are they investing in the right solutions? Are they building a more resilient future?
Because this isn't just about California. This is about how we as a nation face this growing threat of climate-related disasters. What we learn here is going to impact the entire country.
Absolutely, well said. This crisis has exposed our weaknesses, but it's also shown us how resilient and innovative we can be. The choices we make now will determine what kind of future we build.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into this complex and evolving situation. We want to thank you for joining us today, and we encourage you to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. The future is not set in stone. We have the power to shape it together.